Do you fear that Labour is on course for a landslide win, like 1997, or maybe more?
I mean, I think you have to accept that Labour is the strong favourite to win the next general election, but it's not entirely out of the question that the Conservatives could still find a narrow route through.
So what would you recommend to Rishi Sunak that he does to do that?
Well, I mean, he has got to stick with the plan. We've got to get inflation. We've got to get inflation under control. There was some good news this month on inflation. The small boats worry people. People need to feel optimistic about the future as well. And they're not feeling very optimistic at the moment, but that could change over the next 6 months if we can get on top of this inflation issue.
Right. So you
and
think
that starts to ease.
"Is the economy stupid" was the phrase coined by Bill Clinton, wasn't it? And in the US election campaign all those years ago. I mean, is that how you see it? Should Rishi Sunak ditch some of these net zero policies that are very unpopular with a lot of rank and file Conservatives?
Well, I thought it was quite interesting, Kathy. You know, I'm not fighting the next general election, but what I thought was interesting was when the reality of a large tax rise collides with the electorate, as it did in Uxbridge. And I think whoever wins the next general election is going to have to cut spending. And that is going to be very difficult for the Labour Party to do. But I just don't think there's an option. I mean, this month, we borrowed 18.5 billion. I think it was the third or fourth most ever borrowed in June. So both political parties are going to have to be honest with the electorate about their post-general election plans. And I think it's going to be more difficult for Labour to do that, to be honest, than the Conservative Party. The Conservative Party are expected to be tough on public finances, whereas the Labour Party is expected to be more generous to the unions and the public sector. And Labour's going to find it very difficult. Actually, it's going to find it impossible to do that. And that is going to cause it some discomfort.
Well, in his comments on the by-election results today, Sir Keir Starmer said that one of the cries for change, as he put it, from the electorate was to repair the public services. You can't do that if you're cutting spending.
Well, I think that's what he's saying now. But he's going to have to persuade the public then that there is more scope for significant tax rises, and there just aren't. I just don't think the public, as much as they like to talk about public services, are willing now to be taxed more. People are household budgets are under huge amount of pressure at the moment, and people just are not willing to pay more. You said it on green taxes, on ULEZ charges. They won't want to pay more income tax. They won't want to pay more VAT. The Labour Party's scope to raise significant amount of revenue is very, very narrow. Of course, it will charge VAT and business rates on school fees, but that is going to raise a negligible amount of money, and that's a bit of red meat, if I could say that, for its core vote.
Well, apart from cutting spending, Lord Frost, the Conservative peer, said today that Rishi Sunak should scale back the net zero policies. He said the lesson is surely that green policies are very unpopular when there's a direct cost to people, as indeed all the polling says. This time that hit Labour, but soon it could be us unless we rethink heat pumps and the 2030 electric car deadline. You obviously agree with the first part of his statement. Do you agree with the second?
I mean, I think the electric car deadline is arbitrary. What I would favour is extending the hybrid model. So, for example, by 2030, you could say all cars on the road have to be all new cars have to be 50-50 hybrids, so they can get half their mileage from electricity that they self-generate, half from petrol. Then 5 years later, 25-75. So you have a longer phasing out period, if that makes sense. I just don't think the electric car technology is there at the moment to support a phase out of the of new petrol cars within the next 6.5 years. I just don't think the technology's there for cars.
So dilute the net zero policies. Then you'd be in favour of that.
I mean, I think you can still have the ambition of net zero, but we're not talking about diluting net zero. We're specifically now talking about cars. And I just don't think, I think the next government, again, whoever wins the general election, is going to have to shift that 2030 target, purely because I don't think the technology is there to allow people to completely abandon the petrol car in 6 years. That's a technology problem. And I think politicians can wish as much as they like that they can get rid of petrol cars in 2030 or new petrol cars. They just simply won't be able to, because the technology is not there for electric cars, nor is there the charging infrastructure.
But let me put the contrary argument to you briefly, which is, if you look at, the Mediterranean burning, the US burning, climate change concerns people because they see those images on their screens. And that partly potentially explains why the Greens did really pretty well in these by-elections.
So I think if you really want to address global warming in a serious way, as I do, then you've got to look at having more nuclear power stations. And I think if there's any charge that could be levelled at the politicians of the past 40 years, both Conservative and Labour, is their unwillingness to build nuclear power stations. If the world is going to eventually be consumed and destroyed by the burning of fossil fuels, you would accept the manageable risk of nuclear power, as they do in France. So I would hope that in pursuit of net zero, we are much more aggressive in, we actually start to build new nuclear power stations as opposed to decommissioning all our old ones.
Right. Just a final thought. You were key in trying to get Boris Johnson out. You were one of his staunchest critics. And yet, in his seat, the Tories have won again. Were you wrong?
No, I wasn't. I mean, I wasn't one of Boris Johnson's staunchest critics. I think I came on your show and I said, personally, I'm very fond of him, but I think he's the weight of his back catalogue of problems is going to overwhelm him, which it did. No, I mean, I wonder personally if Boris Johnson regrets not having accepted his suspension and then fought the seat on what I imagine would have been the recall vote. I wonder if there's a pang of regret with him at the moment, because he may well have won it as well if he'd stood again.
I said that was the final question, but I have thought of one more. Sorry. The mood has turned, hasn't it, for the Tories? I mean, do you think there's a high probability you're at the point of no return now?
Well, actually, the mood, I mean, I think actually, as I said at the start of your interview, I think when significant tax rises or the threat of significant tax rises collides with the electorate, there's a strong pushback. And I think this is given that, look, and as I said, I'm not fighting the next general election, so I don't want to be over partisan about this. But I do think it gives Labour quite a lot to think about, that
also gives,
which I expected us to lose all three, to be perfectly honest. I mean, I really did. It's not quite midterm. We're past the midterm, but we're still 15 or 16 months from a general election date.
But you say it gives Labour something to think about. But I mean, you could say, well, it gives Rishi Sunak a risk to cut taxes in the run up to the election.
But governments have to think about it all the time, because they're in government and it's their decisions that count. If I was Rishi Sunak, I would fight the election on, look, we're a safe pair of hands. We're not going to do anything rash to try and restore our electoral fortunes. I told you what I was going to do, and I'm going to stick to that mission. And if it means at the end of the day I lose the general election, at least I know I'll be handing the country over in the best possible condition to an incoming Labour government, if indeed we lose that general election.
Right.